What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Jacob Daniel back at it again here at the Speed Kills podcast. With the 2019 NFL season vastly approaching, today I thought I would focus on the most fantasy football relevant Bengals. Those players obviously being Joe Mixon, AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, John Ross, and Andy Dalton. And I'll talk a little bit about Tyler Eifert at the end. I'm going to talk about their fantasy relevance, how good of a fantasy pick each one of these players would be, and what they could do for your fantasy team. So I'd first like to clarify some of the fantasy lingo that I'll be using throughout this episode. So when I say running back 1, wide receiver 1, that means that this player at the end of the season will rank either 1 through 12, that's running back 1. Running back 2 is ranking 13 through 24, and so on and so forth. That's used the same for wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends. There's going to be more running backs, so your running back 2s and 3s could have value. Your wide receiver 3s are going to have a lot of value too, because there's a ton of wide receivers in the NFL, and especially with having a flex on your fantasy team, running backs and wide receivers are really valuable. The first fantasy relevant Bengal is obviously Joe Mixon. I think he's the most valuable fantasy Bengal out of any of the players on the team. He will be the first Bengal drafted in your fantasy league off the board. To me, he's a locked and loaded running back 1. I see Joe Mixon getting a lot of touches in the new Zach Taylor offense. I think he's going to be utilized more in the passing game, so that means more receptions for him. And if you're in a PPR league, I think that'll help a lot, especially with him getting more catches. That means more points and more overall total yards. I see him being a top 10 fantasy running back. I think he'd kind of be towards the back of the top end, so I think he'll probably rank 7 through 10, but I see him being a top 10 running back in fantasy football just because what we saw last year from Mixon, I think he could even improve on that and actually have a better season than he did last year. He led the AFC in rushing yards. He had a lot of total yards, and I believe that he can improve on those numbers. And I think the offense in Cincinnati is going to run through him. I think there's going to be a lot of run-first offense, and then they'll develop play-action pass off that running game. And I think Mixon is a great player to do that, and I think that he's a very valuable asset to your fantasy football team. So the second most fantasy relevant Bengal to me is AJ Green. And AJ Green, these past 2 seasons, he has dealt with injury, and if you've drafted him, he's kind of been a disappointment. And it's all going to depend on if AJ Green is healthy, because if AJ Green is healthy, he's going to be a very good fantasy football player for your team. I consider him a fringe wide receiver 1 or 2. I see him being a low wide receiver 1 ranking or a high wide receiver 2 number ranking. He's probably going to go in the 3rd or 4th round in your fantasy football draft. I don't see him being, what he was, back in 2015 with all the Bengals being great fantasy players, because AJ Green's getting a little older, and like I said, he's dealt with a lot of injuries, so he's almost kind of a risk to draft, especially that early in the draft in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th round, because you're still getting, your money makers in those rounds. So it will be tough to draft AJ Green, but if you believe in him, then I would draft him. And another thing too is the next player that I'm going to talk about is Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd getting more targets in the slot means less targets for Green to go around. Like I said, that's not very good for AJ Green, considering less targets for him. But AJ Green, he'll score touchdowns and he'll have a lot of receiving yards if he's healthy for 16 games. So I think if he plays 16 games, he's going to be a low wide receiver 1. But if he only plays, 10 to 12 games, then I believe that he's going to be a wide receiver 3, and he won't be really fantasy relevant whatsoever. If AJ Green plays 16 games, he'll be a very good fantasy player for your fantasy football team. All right, the next most fantasy relevant Bengal for me is Tyler Boyd. I see Tyler Boyd being a low wide receiver 2, but he has high upside. Tyler Boyd has a great connection with Andy Dalton, and if we see that again this year like we did last year when Andy Dalton was healthy, then the sky's the limit for Tyler Boyd. He's going to be a PPR stud because he's going to get a lot of catches in the slot, and he may not have a ton of yards, but he's going to have a lot of catches, especially with that connection with Andy Dalton. To be honest, where you're going to get Boyd, you're probably going to get him round 6 to 8, and I would rather draft Tyler Boyd than AJ Green just because lower draft price with higher upside, and I think Tyler Boyd is a phenomenal wide receiver, and I think he's going to do good things for the Bengals in the new Zach Taylor offense, and I believe they're going to get him more receptions in the slot. Like I said, in a PPR league, he's going to be way more valuable than in your standard league. I like Tyler Boyd as a fantasy option for your fantasy football team. So my second to last Bengal that I'm going to talk about with fantasy football is John Ross. Now, John Ross, you're not going to draft really early. He's going to be a late round flyer, so he's going to be, your second to last or your last pick in the draft. And what he is, I call that a late round flyer, or he's going to be a waiver wire target because he's probably going to have to prove himself for you to to get him on your team. He had 7 touchdowns last year in limited amount of playing time because he was injured some, and he does have that injury risk. But if he is healthy and if he gets a good connection with Andy Dalton, then I see him being like a Brandon Cooks type deal, which is a boom or bust kind of guy week in and week out. But that could be good for your fantasy team. And he has been a red zone target for the Cincinnati Bengals, like I said, 7 touchdowns last year. And I would not be surprised if Ross went with one game with 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, because if he gets hot, I believe that he'll have really good games. But if John Ross is healthy, that late round pick could have a lot of value, and it would be a really good pick for your fantasy football team. So the last Bengal that I'm going to talk about is Andy Dalton. I wouldn't be drafting Andy Dalton if you play in a 1 quarterback league. If you play in a 2 quarterback league, I can see you drafting him. But Andy Dalton is really going to be a waiver wire target or a week-to-week guy that you might pick up off the waiver wire and plug and play and start him. Andy Dalton's never been really a guy that you're going to draft and have a ton of success with. He could provide really good numbers for you, especially if in the new Zach Taylor offense, he will be more successful. But I do not see anyone drafting Andy Dalton. I see them picking him up off the waiver wire. And that has its value, but it could burn you if he has a really bad game. But I do not see anyone drafting Andy Dalton. Quarterback-wise, he's probably going to be a quarterback 2, which it's kind of really easy to be a quarterback 2. And if you're not a quarterback 1, then you don't have a ton of value. But week to week, he might have value for your team, and he could be a good asset for your fantasy football team. Thank you so much for listening. That's all I have for you guys today. Make sure to stay tuned here on the Speed Kills podcast as I continue to pump out quality content for you guys. I'm planning on putting out more content on fantasy football here in the future. In general, running back rankings, I'm planning on doing a fantasy football mock draft. So be on the lookout for those and make sure to stay tuned for the next episode.